It was a crisp autumn morning when I first noticed the fluorescent orange flyer taped to my mailbox. I'd been living on my 5-acre property at the edge of Willow Creek Estates for nearly 3 years without incident. The land had been zoned agricultural long before the housing development sprouted up around it, and my small working farm was completely legal according to county records. I grew organic vegetables that I sold at the local farmers market, and kept a few chickens and 2 miniature goats that delighted the neighborhood children who would visit with their parents on weekends. I pulled the paper from my mailbox and read, "Notice of violation. All unauthorized vehicles must be removed from the community parking area within 48 hours or will be towed at owner's expense, by order of the Willow Creek Estates HOA Board." There was a signature at the bottom, Karen Wilkinson, HOA President, written with such force that the pen had nearly torn through the paper. What community parking area? This is my property, I thought to myself as I surveyed my land. My old red tractor sat near the barn and my pickup truck was parked in the gravel driveway beside my house. Nothing was out of the ordinary. I flipped the notice over, looking for more information, but found nothing. I sighed, knowing exactly what this was about. Karen Wilkinson had moved into the neighborhood 6 months ago and almost immediately campaigned her way onto the HOA board, then orchestrated a coup to become president. Since then, she'd been on a crusade to improve property values by imposing increasingly arbitrary rules on everyone. I'd largely avoided her wrath since my property was grandfathered in with special zoning, but it seemed my luck had run out. That afternoon, I called the number listed on the HOA website. After 3 rings, a sharp voice answered. "Willow Creek Estates HOA, this is President Wilkinson speaking." "Hi Karen, this is James Mitchell from the farm property on Orchard Lane. I received a violation notice about vehicles in a community parking area, but I'm confused because—" "Mr. Mitchell," she interrupted, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, "I'm well aware of who you are. The board has voted to designate the open field on your property as overflow community parking for our upcoming fall festival. You've been using too much of your land for unauthorized purposes anyway. Our covenants clearly state that all common areas must be maintained for community use." I took a deep breath before responding. "Karen, my property isn't subject to those covenants. I have agricultural zoning that predates the development, which is documented with both the county and your HOA's own records. No one can just declare my private property to be community parking." There was a pause before Karen replied, her voice noticeably colder. "Listen here, Mr. Mitchell. I've reviewed all the documentation and the board has made its decision. Your so-called farm is an eyesore that's bringing down property values in our premium community. The festival is this weekend and we will be using that field for parking. Any vehicles or structures you have there need to be moved immediately. If you choose to be difficult about this, we're prepared to issue daily fines until you comply." My blood pressure was rising, but I kept my tone even. "I understand you're new to the board, so perhaps you haven't had time to review the legal documents regarding my property. I'd be happy to show you the—" "I don't need to see anything," she snapped. "I suggest you consult Section 8, Paragraph 12 of the updated bylaws that were passed last month. The board now has the authority to designate temporary use of undeveloped land for community purposes." With that, she hung up. I stood there, phone in hand, completely stunned. There was no way such a bylaw could legally apply to my property, which wasn't even part of the HOA's jurisdiction except for a small portion of my front yard that overlapped with the development's entrance. I immediately called my lawyer, who confirmed what I already knew. They couldn't just claim my land. The next morning, I awoke to the sound of engines. I rushed outside in my bathrobe to find Karen directing a small convoy of cars onto my east field, where I had been preparing to plant winter wheat. A large handmade sign had been staked into the ground. "Willow Creek Estates Festival Parking." "What do you think you're doing?" I called out, marching toward Karen, who was wearing a high-visibility vest with HOA President emblazoned across the back in large letters. "Enforcing the bylaws, Mr. Mitchell," she replied without turning around. Since you failed to clear the area as instructed, we're doing it for you. You'll find the fines for non-compliance added to your account. Karen, you and these people are trespassing on private property. I need everyone to leave immediately." She finally turned to face me, clipboard in hand and a smug smile on her face. "Actually, according to our legal counsel, this portion of land falls under community easement due to the road access requirements. We've filed the appropriate paperwork with the county." "That's absolutely false and you know it," I replied, struggling to keep my voice level, as more cars began pulling into my field, their tires cutting into the soil I had spent years nurturing. "I'm calling the police." Karen's smile only widened. "Go ahead. I have all the documentation right here. The responding officers can sort it out, but in the meantime we have a festival to prepare for." She turned away dismissively and continued waving cars into my field. I retreated to my house and called the non-emergency police line, explaining the situation as calmly as I could. While waiting for them to arrive, I gathered all my property documents, zoning records, and the original agreement with the developers from when they built Willow Creek Estates around my pre-existing farm. 2 officers arrived about 20 minutes later. By then, at least 15 cars had parked in my field, and Karen had set up a folding table where she was collecting $5 from each vehicle. When she spotted the police cruiser, she straightened her vest and marched over with her clipboard, reaching them before I could. "Officers, thank you for coming. I'm Karen Wilkinson, president of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. We're setting up for our community fall festival, and unfortunately, one of our residents is causing a disturbance." She gestured toward me with her clipboard. The older officer, whose nameplate read Sergeant Rodriguez, looked between us. "We received a call about trespassing?" I stepped forward. "Yes, that was me. This is my private property and these people are trespassing. I have all the documentation right here showing that this land is zoned agricultural and is not subject to HOA authority except for a small section at the front entrance." Karen scoffed. "Officers, as I was explaining, our bylaws clearly state—" "Ma'am," Sergeant Rodriguez interrupted gently, "HOA bylaws don't override county zoning laws or property rights. Could I see both of your documentation, please?" I handed over my folder of paperwork while Karen reluctantly passed over her clipboard. The officers reviewed the documents for several minutes while Karen stood with her arms crossed, tapping her foot impatiently. I noticed her documentation consisted mostly of highlighted HOA bylaws and what appeared to be a crudely modified property map. "Mr. Mitchell," Sergeant Rodriguez finally said, "your documentation appears to be in order. This is indeed private property with agricultural zoning that supersedes HOA regulations." He turned to Karen. "Miss Wilkinson, on the other hand, your paperwork doesn't provide any legal basis for using this land without the owner's permission." Karen's face flushed crimson. "That's ridiculous! I filed the easement papers myself last week." "Filing papers doesn't mean they were approved," the officer replied patiently. "According to county records, which we just verified, there's no such easement on this property." "This is an emergency community need," Karen protested, her voice rising. "As HOA president, I have the authority to—" "Ms. Wilkinson," the younger officer interjected, "you don't have the authority to claim someone else's private property regardless of your position. You and these vehicles need to leave immediately or you could be charged with criminal trespassing." Karen's mouth opened and closed several times before she finally found her voice. "Fine. But this isn't over, Mitchell. The board will be discussing this at our next meeting." She stormed off toward the parked cars. I thought that would be the end of it, but Karen Wilkinson wasn't one to admit defeat easily. Over the next 2 weeks, I received daily violation notices for everything from excessive agricultural activity to unauthorized livestock to improper mailbox height. Each notice came with increasingly large fines. I documented everything and forwarded it all to my lawyer, who sent cease and desist letters that Karen simply ignored. Things escalated when I came home one evening to find a work crew installing floodlights around the perimeter of my farm field. Karen stood supervising, clipboard in hand as always. "What's happening now?" I asked, exhausted by the ongoing battle. Karen smiled that artificial smile. The board voted to improve visibility for the safety and security of our community. Since your property borders our development, we're installing proper lighting. On my property? Without permission? She waved her clipboard dismissively. The utility easement gives us the right. The utility easement is for underground utilities and is only 10 feet wide along the road, I countered. These lights are nearly 30 feet onto my property. Our legal team has reinterpreted the easement terms, she replied confidently. I'd had enough. Stop work immediately, I called out to the crew. You're installing these lights without property owner permission or proper permits. The workers looked uncertainly between Karen and me. One of them spoke up. Ma'am, we need to see the permits if there's a dispute. Karen huffed. The HOA doesn't need permits for improvements within our jurisdiction. But this isn't within your jurisdiction, I said firmly, and I think the county building inspector would be very interested to hear about unpermitted electrical work. I took out my phone as if to make a call. The work crew leader quickly signaled his team. Sorry folks, we can't continue without clear documentation. We'll need to come back when this is sorted out. Despite Karen's protest, they packed up their equipment and left. Karen pointed a manicured finger at me. You're obstructing community improvements. The fines for this will be substantial. I sighed. Karen, this has gone far enough. I've been patient, but you're repeatedly trespassing and attempting to make unauthorized modifications to my property. If this continues, I'll have no choice but to take legal action. Go ahead, she sneered. The HOA has a much bigger legal budget than you do, farmer. She stalked off to her luxury SUV, parked on the road, and drove away with tires screeching. The next day brought the most outrageous escalation yet. I returned from the farmer's market to find a large sign installed at the entrance to my driveway. Willow Creek Estates Public Parking, HOA members only. A chain had been stretched across my driveway and Karen's SUV was parked sideways behind it, blocking access completely. Karen herself sat in a folding chair beside her vehicle, sunglasses on, seemingly waiting for my arrival. I pulled up and got out of my truck. You've got to be kidding me. You're physically blocking access to my home now? Karen didn't even stand up. This entrance has been redesignated as a private community access point. Your continued violations of community standards have left the board no choice but to restrict your property usage until all fines are paid in full. She handed me a bill for over $12,000. Looking at the outrageous sum, something clicked in my mind. Throughout this entire ordeal, I'd been so focused on proving Karen wrong that I'd forgotten my strongest leverage. I couldn't help but smile as the realization washed over me. Karen, do you know where the power substation for Willow Creek Estates is located? She frowned at the apparent change of subject. What does that have to do with anything? It's on my property, I said calmly. When the developers built this neighborhood, they needed somewhere to put the substation. The only suitable location was on the corner of my land. In exchange for allowing them to place it here, I received certain guarantees, including complete exemption from HOA rules except for the small frontage area. Karen's expression faltered slightly. You're making that up. Not at all. It's in the original development agreement which is filed with the county. The same agreement stipulates that if there's ever an attempt to enforce HOA rules on my property, I have the right to terminate the electrical easement with 30 days' notice. I paused, letting the information sink in. Of course, that would mean the power company would need to find a new location for the substation and reroute all the electrical infrastructure. From what I understand, that could leave the neighborhood without power for weeks, maybe months. The color drained from Karen's face. You wouldn't dare. I've been patient, Karen. I've tried to resolve this reasonably, but you've trespassed on my property, attempted to steal my land, blocked access to my home, and issued thousands in fraudulent fines, so yes, I would dare to exercise my legal rights. I took out my phone. In fact, I think I'll call the power company right now to give them that 30-day notice. I'm sure the neighbors will understand when you explain to them why their power will be shut off for the foreseeable future. Karen jumped to her feet. Wait, don't do that. Then remove this chain, move your vehicle, take down that sign, and cease all harassment immediately. I said firmly. "And I want a written acknowledgement that my property is exempt from HOA regulations as per the original agreement." Karen's hands trembled as she unlocked the chain. "The board will hear about your threats," she muttered. "It's not a threat, it's a contractual right. And speaking of the board, they should probably know about the potential liability you've created for the HOA. I wonder how they'll feel about having to explain to the homeowners why property values will plummet when there's no electricity." I smiled pleasantly. "My lawyer will be drafting a formal complaint detailing all of your actions, with copies going to every board member and homeowner in Willow Creek Estates." 3 days later, I received an official letter from the Willow Creek Estates HOA board. It contained a full retraction of all violations, cancellation of all fines, and a formal acknowledgement of my property's exempt status. At the bottom was a brief note indicating that, due to personal reasons, Karen Wilkinson had resigned as president of the HOA, effective immediately. Attached was a separate, handwritten apology from Karen herself, clearly produced under duress, in which she admitted to exceeding her authority and apologized for the misunderstanding. That evening, as I was tending to my garden, I noticed Karen supervising movers loading boxes into a moving truck parked in her driveway across the development. Our eyes met briefly before she quickly looked away, her face burning with humiliation. Apparently, living in a community where every neighbor had received a detailed account of her power-mad schemes and where she no longer held any authority was too much for Karen's ego to bear.